The first thing I remember was the sound under the hull, as if some enormous wet sail were being drawn slowly along our planks. The night was breathless, the air warm and heavy, yet our lantern flames guttered inward. Quito whispered that the sea was too black. When I leaned over the rail, I saw, keeping pace below, a pale handspan of foam that never broke. Men have asked me to recount this, though they laugh before the pipe is lit. If you would hear the whole of it, lend your attention, mark your approval, and set down your own thoughts below. Such tales live or die by the ears that receive them. It began 3 weeks earlier, when we still trusted our charts and our own boldness. It was the 12th day of May 1894, when we raised the eastern approaches of Pohnpei, the high green of the island rising from a mild swell. I served as mate aboard the ketch Kelepa, out of Colonia, in the service of a German trader named Haas. Our crew were Micronesian and Chuquiza men for the most part, with myself, a half-blood Pohnpeian familiar with both the lagoon and the language of the colonials. There were 4 whose faces returned to me most clearly. Old Thomas, who had seen whaling days in the South Seas and never allowed his pipe to go out. Quito, hardly 20, from Mokil, whose laughter carried over any sea. Matau, a solemn Chuquize helmsman, broad-shouldered and careful with words. And Haas himself, pale and quick-eyed, who trusted the sextant more than any reef pilot. We had been engaged to carry trade goods and survey several outer atolls east of Pohnpei, for there were whispers of new copra stations and of other things besides, older stories that men spoke of only after much kava. The word Lioumere came up once when we took on water at Sapwaufik. An old woman spat, made a sign against the dark, and turned her face away. Haas laughed and asked if it was a storm or a reef. She only muttered, "It follows. It chooses." I remember how the younger men would not meet her eyes. In those first days, my heart was light. The barometer stayed steady. The trade wind came firm from the east. Our canvas filled well, and we made good time. We had a new German compass, a brass thing Haas polished with affection, and a chronometer packed in cotton. The ketch had been recorked that year. Our rigging was sound, and we thought ourselves well prepared for 15 days among friendly seas. The first oddity was small. On the 3rd day out from Pohnpei, at dawn watch, Matau called me forward to the bow. The sea was calm, a faint drizzle falling, the horizon blurred. He pointed to the wake that trailed from our stern. For 50 yards the water lay untroubled, a smooth, dark lane behind us, as if the sea forgot to close where our hull had cut it. Only beyond that distance did normal ripples and little whitecaps begin. I said something of currents and oil from the galley, though I knew well that no cook could flatten so broad a path. Matau said nothing, but I felt his gaze upon my back as I returned amidships. That evening, after the lamp was trimmed, we sat by the mainmast and shared tobacco. Quito spoke of his new child on Mokil, born just before we sailed, and asked whether the Germans would pay enough that he might buy cloth for the boy. Old Thomas told of a time he had seen whales sounding near Nauru, their backs like islands. Haas listened with that thin half-smile of the European who thinks all such tales are a kind of theatre. I recall the warmth of the lantern on my face, the smell of boiled tar and fish, the easy laughter. If I had understood how brief that ease would be, I might have listened more closely to the wind. On the 5th day, the wind freshened and then fell away with unusual speed. By late afternoon, The sea lay like dark glass, and our sails drooped. It was not the calm that unsettled me, but the silence. Even on the stillest days there is some small sound, the slap of water against planks, the creak of rigging, the murmur of men. That hour there was nothing. Our halyards hung motionless. No rope rubbed, no block squealed. When I spoke to Quito by the rail, my own voice startled me, as if it belonged to another man. We rode that dead calm into the evening. The sky cleared to a low red, then to a violet so deep it seemed to swallow the stars. I felt the air grow warmer, heavy as wetted cloth. The men muttered of Lioumere then, using the word as a name for the hush itself. Haas scoffed and said only that the sea could not chase anyone when there was no wind. Yet he checked the compass twice that night, running a finger around the brass rim. Near midnight, I woke suddenly in my berth to a faint tapping beneath the hull, rhythmic and soft. I lay listening. It resembled the slow striking of a hand upon planking, once, twice, then a pause, then three in quick succession. When I rose and pressed my palm against the inner skin of the ketch, the wood there felt strangely cool, as if a current of colder water ran directly under that portion only. I told myself it was some fish, perhaps a school bumping against us in the dark. Still, I lay awake until first light. 2 mornings later, we found the first clear trace. Quito had the bilge duty and went below with a lantern and bucket. He was gone longer than seemed needed. When he came up, his brown face looked grey, his lips pale. Wordlessly, he handed me the lamp and motioned me down. On the inner hull, just above the normal damp line, there ran 3 long streaks of discoloration, each the width of a man's hand, parallel as if drawn by fingers. The wood there was not gouged or scraped, merely stained a darker hue, as though sea creatures had rested there for years rather than hours. When I put my ear to the planks, the timber felt chill against my skin. And, for a moment, I thought I heard a slow rush, not of water, but of breath. I told Haas, and he snorted. "Some fool has spilled oil," he said. Yet I saw him hesitate when Quito described how high the streaks lay above the bilge water, too high for any liquid to have splashed and settled thus. Haas ordered them scrubbed and not spoken of again. That was the way of it for days. Some new sign, some effort to explain. A line frayed through in a single night of calm. A coil of rope found stiff with brine where no spray could reach. Flying fish that struck the deck at dawn and lay there not flapping, but rigid, their silver eyes clouded as if long dead. Each thing small enough to dismiss, yet together, forming a slow weight in the mind. Around the 10th day we began to hear it more clearly. At first, it was only a suggestion that the sea kept a second voice under the familiar hiss and slap. When the ketch moved, even in the lightest air, there was a low humming under the keel, rising and falling with our speed. Old Thomas compared it to the murmur a whale makes when turning below a boat. Quito said it sounded like someone speaking far underwater, words stretched and lost. One afternoon, as we were still becalmed and the heat lay upon us like a hand, we decided to put out the skiff to fish. It was idle work, and I welcomed it. Haas allowed 3 of us to go, myself, Quito, and Matau. We lowered the little boat and pulled away 20 yards, the larger hull looming above us. The sea there was unnaturally clear. I remember leaning over, my oar idle, and seeing far below a faint shifting, not of fish, but of a darker shade moving within the blue. It was as if some long shadow kept exact pace with us, always just beyond the depth where details might be known. Matao saw it also and muttered a prayer in Chukise. I told him it was perhaps the shadow of our own hull refracted strangely, yet the sky had clouded, the sun hidden, and the darkness below did not change. We took no fish that day. The line hung in water that felt wrong to the touch, colder beneath the surface than the warm air above would promise. My fingertips tingled where the sea lapped them, as if a faint current passed there, not of water, but of something slower and more deliberate. Around this time, the birds left us. For days, small terns and frigates had circled the masts, resting on the yards, crying at dawn. Then, one evening, as the sky reddened, they rose suddenly as one and fled toward the west, leaving the rigging bare. Thereafter, no bird followed our wake. The ocean around us seemed suddenly vast and empty, the horizon line too clean. The men grew short in their tempers. Little things came to anger quickly. Sleep left them. Quito, once bright with song, kept to the foredeck and stared at the water. More than once, I found Matao with his hand resting on the tiller, though the sea lay flat and the sails hung empty, as if he steered against some current only he could feel. On the 12th night, some hours before dawn, the micro-shock that wakes me even now occurred. I had the deck with Haas. The sky held a thin overcast, the sea a black mirror. We spoke quietly of provisions, and of the need perhaps to turn sooner toward Pohnpei if the calm continued. Without warning, there came a crack like musket fire from the foremast, followed by a harsh grinding. Our new German compass, which had sat in its gimbal steady as a judge, spun once about, and then its glass burst inward, shards flying. The needle stood quivering, pointing not north, but several degrees east. At that same instant, the ketch lurched as if a hand had seized her keel and checked her motion, though no swell rolled. I grabbed the rail to remain standing. From the dark forward rose a single cry from Quito, cut short. When we reached him, he sat clutching his right leg, staring not at us but at the water. His bare calf bore 3 pale welts, evenly spaced, that had not been there an hour before, as if pressed by unseen fingers. Haas swore it was some weakness in the compass glass, some eddy, some accidental blow, yet his knuckles stayed white on the rail. We found nothing amiss with the mast. No rope had parted, no block had jammed. The sea about us lay flat as oil. From that night, the sounds changed. Where before there had been tapping and humming, there came now a sort of answering. When one of the men stamped the deck in irritation, a light knock replied from beneath, precisely echoing his rhythm. Once, during the dog watch, I heard Matao testing it like a child, 3 quick raps with the heel of his hand. The hull answered with 3, slightly delayed. He swore softly and did not try again. By the 14th day, the smell came. It crept on us as we lay under a thin breeze, trying to shape a course back toward Pohnpei. At first, I thought some fish had rotted in a locker. It was a faint musk with a sourness beneath, like old weed turned in the sun. Yet it came and went with no relation to the galley or stores. Once it grew strongest on the open bow, where nothing lay but coiled rope and salt-washed planks. The odour seemed to rise from the very seam between wood and water. That evening, the men met without Haas upon the foredeck. Old Thomas spoke then of Lioumere by name, not as a tale for boys, but as something that had once shadowed a canoe from Kosrae to Pohnpei in his youth. He told of nights when the paddlers had heard breathing under them as they rested their arms, and of a pale shape that kept pace without ever breaking the surface. He had thought it a dream then, or the fear of younger men. Yet here we were, and with marks upon our hull and an emptiness all about. I asked him what was to be done. He shook his head. "It chooses," he said. "Sometimes it passes. Sometimes it follows until men speak to it, and then no one returns." His eyes looked toward Haas in the stern. I felt the old division between island custom and European order lie heavy upon us. In the end, we did nothing but share the last of the good tobacco and speak of home. Quito, his legs still bearing those pale welts, whispered of his child again, and whether the boy would remember his face if he did not return. The direct sighting came on the 16th night, 2 days after we had set our course firmly west by dead reckoning, the compass now untrusted, the chronometer still ticking like a heart in its wooden box. Low cloud pressed the sky. A thin rain fell. The lantern under the booms swung with barely any motion of the hull, yet its flame bent at odd angles as if a wind moved inside the glass. I had turned from a brief word with Haas aft when a murmur rose from forward, not loud, but filled with a quality that made my own skin crawl. It was not fear in the voice of the man who spoke, but a blank astonishment. "It is there," Quito said, not shouting, merely stating, as if remarking on an approaching canoe. I crossed the deck. He stood at the bow, one hand on the forestay, the other pointing down. Old Thomas and Matau flanked him, their faces set. The water ahead of our stem was wrong. That is the only word for it. The black mirror of the sea, which had reflected the grey sky so faithfully, now showed a long, uneven shape running parallel with our course, half a ship length off the starboard bow. It was not above the surface, nor entirely below it. Rather, the skin of the ocean over that shape seemed thinner, as if stretched over something that moved just underneath. 3 times I saw a slight bulge climb upward and travel along it, like a great back rolling in slow motion, yet no fin, no head, no tail broke free. The smell there was strongest, a wet musk with a bitter edge that stung the nose. As we watched, the line of disturbed water kept exact pace with us, though the wind had nearly died and our own headway was little more than a drift. I realized then that the sensation of motion I had felt for hours, the sense that the ketch slipped along faster than the faint breeze would grant, came not from wind or current, but from something else lending us its speed. No one spoke for several breaths. I remember hearing my own pulse in my ears, and beneath it, very faint, a sound like distant surf, though there were no reefs within many miles. Then, as if feeling our gaze, the shape drew closer. The water between hull and disturbance narrowed until, looking straight down from the rail, I saw at last something more. There lay directly under our planking, almost touching, a breadth of pale matter, broad as 4 men lying alongside, extending beyond the limit of our lantern light. It was not the hide of any whale or fish I had known, for it bore no scales, no barnacles, no clear texture. It resembled perhaps the inner flesh of a coconut, smooth and firm, yet faintly ribbed in long parallel lines. At one point, close beneath where Quito stood, those lines curved inward, forming a darker oval shape. In the dim light, it seemed to open slightly, then narrow again, as if something within regarded us with a slow, measuring attention. Quito whispered in a voice that shook, "Do not speak to it." Old Thomas clapped a hand over the younger man's mouth, as if fearful that even that warning might count as address. Haas, who had come up behind me, made a strangled sound and backed away, colliding with the mainmast. The temperature on deck dropped then. My breath did not quite smoke, but the sweat upon my neck turned cold. Every hair on my arms rose. The lantern flame burned straight, unmoving, though I felt no breeze. Under us, the pale expanse shifted, and the whole ketch tilted a fraction, as if we rode not water, but the back of something vast. We might have remained thus until our wits broke, staring down at that mute presence, had not a new sound risen over all. From the surrounding darkness came the sudden clamour of many fish breaking water at once, a frantic splashing that circled us and then fled outward, growing fainter. Creatures we could not see burst from the deep and fled the company that we kept. Then, as quietly as it had drawn near, the pale breadth slipped away. The disturbed ribbon on the surface narrowed, lengthened, and passed under our bow into the black ahead, vanishing beyond the circle of lantern light. The smell faded. The cold left the air. The sea around us became again only sea. None of us spoke for some time. When at last Haas found his voice, he ordered that the incident be kept between us. "We are tired," he said. "The calm plays tricks. There is nothing in this beyond a school of fish or a whale." His words fell flat. No man answered him. The days that followed formed the long withdrawing of that presence, like an outgoing tide that left behind strange traces. Our water barrels, carefully sealed, began to taste first flat, then faintly of that same musk, though no sign of rot showed to the eye. A length of spare canvas stored in the lazarette was found torn along its breadth, not by teeth nor knife, but parted as if swollen from within and split. At night, even when no moon showed and the sky lay heavy, our shadows on the deck seemed sharper than they had any right to be, as if some hidden light beneath the planks threw them upward. We bent every effort toward Pohnpei. Without trusting the compass, we sailed by sun and stars when we could see them, and by the set of the swell and the remembered bearings of distant islets when we could not. The wind returned in brief, fitful gusts that died as soon as our sails filled, as if something about us disliked the sound of canvas drawing. I began to dream of that pale breadth beneath the hull. In my sleep, I walked the deck and felt a thickness underfoot, an almost imperceptible rise and fall that had nothing to do with waves. I woke once with my hands pressed flat to the planks, as if feeling for a heartbeat below. The men changed. Matau, who had been steady, grew furtive, glancing often at the water, refusing to sleep near the hull. He rigged his hammock between mast and boom and swung there like a child rather than rest in his berth. Old Thomas smoked constantly, his pipe a little red star in the dark. Quito moved more quietly, his laughter gone. Once I heard him speaking softly toward the bow in his own tongue, and when I approached, he fell silent, his face shuttered. Whether he addressed Lioumere with supplication or warning, I cannot say. The peak of it came on the 18th night, when at last the high silhouette of Pohnpei had shown faintly by day a darker smudge upon the horizon. We knew then that, if our reckoning held, we might reach the shelter of Colonia within another sunrise or two. The men spoke of land fires, of women, and of real earth beneath their feet. For the first time in many days, hope rose among us. That night, the sky was moonless but clear, the stars bright as polished brass. A faint breeze gave us way. I had the middle watch. The ketch moved with a gentle, steady motion, the sort that lulls even anxious minds. I paced the deck, listening to the small creaks I had once missed. The humming beneath the hull had faded in recent days until I might have believed I imagined it. Yet occasionally a faint echo came when the bow met a ripple. It must have been shortly before 2 bells when the air changed. I smelled it first, that musk, suddenly strong, as if someone had thrown open a hidden hatch in the sea. At the same moment, every rope along the rail tightened, as if wetted and drawn, though no hand touched them. The faint wind died. The sails slackened, then bellied out again without any shift in the air, as though some vast body passed under us and lent a draught of its own passage. The darkness around the ketch changed also. The sea, which had shown small reflections of the stars, now appeared flat and depthless, absorbing all light. Our hull seemed to float not upon water, but upon a great expanse of black glass. From the stern, I heard old Thomas mutter, "It has come to choose." Then came the sound I shall take to my grave. Rising from directly beneath us, from that thin interval between wood and ocean, came a long, low exhalation, unmistakably the release of held breath. It swelled slowly, like wind beginning in a cave, then narrowed and focused until it resembled something very near to a word spoken in no human tongue. The planks under my feet trembled with it. My bones seemed to vibrate. Men stumbled from their berths, faces pale in the starlight. Haas appeared, hair disordered, a pistol in his hand that looked suddenly childish. Quito clutched the rail, his eyes wide. "Do not answer," he whispered. "No matter what you hear, do not answer." The exhalation ceased. In the ringing silence that followed, another sound reached us, faint but clear from far off the beam. Someone called my name. I stepped to the starboard side and peered out. Upon that black surface there stood, impossibly, the figure of my younger brother, as he had been 10 years before, when sickness took him. He wore the same tattered shirt he had died in, the same crooked smile, and his bare feet did not sink. The stars shone behind and through him, as if his body were made of smoke. "Come," he said, his voice as it had been in youth. "The paddling is easy here." My throat tightened. The part of me that had not yet loosed itself from all sense began to frame an answer. Behind me, Quito seized my arm with a strength born of terror. "Do not speak," he hissed. "It is never who it seems." At the bow, I heard another voice, that of Matau's mother, long dead, calling softly in his own language. And from aft came a German woman's weeping, which I later understood to be Haas' remembered bride from Bremen. The sea around us filled with these soft appeals, each man hearing his own dead, each enticed by a familiar cadence. The temptation to reply, to say only a word, was like thirst. Beneath it all, the slow breathing resumed, patient, as if the thing under our hull waited to see which of us would be the first to answer. The ketch no longer moved by any ordinary means. There were no waves, no wind. Yet the stars overhead seemed to slide more swiftly, as if we were drawn along by some unseen tow line. It was as though Lioumere, in whatever form it knew itself, bore us upon its back. My tongue touched my teeth. I tasted that musk, faint even upon my own breath. With an effort that seemed to tear something within, I pressed my lips together and gripped the rail until my knuckles ached. Around me, in that strained quiet, I heard a single broken whisper. It was Haas, answering in German, one word only, the name of the woman whose memory wept in his ears. What followed, I recall in flashes, as if the mind consented to remember only in pieces. The deck heaved once, not with the roll of a wave, but with a sharp upward jerk, as if some great muscle had flexed beneath us. Haas cried out and was gone from my side. There came a splash, not loud, but irrevocable. The pistol skittered across the planks. We rushed to the rail in a frozen instant. The water below showed nothing. No pale flesh, no grasping limb, no struggling man. Only an area of intense darkness that spread in a slow circle, like ink released from beneath. The breathing gave one long, a shuddering intake, and then ceased entirely. For a space that might have been seconds or years, we hung there on the rail, listening to nothing. Then, far to the west, a faint line of grey appeared, the first suggestion of dawn. A wind rose, fitful and cool. The stars paled. The sea under us returned to itself with small, ordinary ripples. The musk thinned and blew away. We searched for Haas until the light grew strong enough to show us only our own frightened faces reflected in the water. There was no broken plank, no shred of clothing, no blood. Had any authority asked, we might have said he had slipped in the dark. Yet all who stood that watch knew that something had taken note of his small answer and acted upon it. The return to Pohnpei from that point was swift and strangely uneventful. The wind held steady from the east. Birds appeared again, first in twos and threes, then in larger flocks, until terns once more circled our mast. The humming under the hull did not come again. The taste of the water from our barrels slowly lost its bitterness. We did not speak of Lioumere aloud, yet our silence bulged with the shape of what lay beneath it. Upon raising Colonia on the 20th day, we saw the white of the German station, the neat flag, the familiar fringe of palm. Men on the pier waved, thinking our delay a matter of weather or idleness. When we tied up, our hands shook more than any storm had ever caused them to. The solidity of the timber beneath my feet when I stepped ashore seemed unreal, not as if earth itself might at any moment give way to some greater depth. The colonial authorities received our report with the thin patience of men who prefer not to believe. I set down the facts of our voyage as the official log demanded: dates, positions by estimation, the loss of Captain Haas in the night under circumstances assumed accidental. The matter of the broken compass glass I attributed to a fall. The strange calm I described as unusual but not unprecedented. No record was made of the pale breadth under our keel, of the voices, of the smell. In private, among my own people, the tale spread quickly, embroidered by others with details I had not given. Some called it proof that the old stories had teeth beyond the reach of foreign charts. Others said we had offended something by sailing without proper chant or offering. A few suggested we had only frightened ourselves in an unremarkable calm. I listened to all and kept my own counsel. The Germans published a brief notice that Haas had been lost at sea while in the diligent pursuit of his commercial duties. Their paper gave more space to the arrival of new machinery for the copra press than to the passing of the man whose command we had followed. No mention was made of Lioumere. To do so would have been to admit that there were forces around those islands for which Berlin had no proper word. Years have passed since then. I have sailed many voyages, some in the service of the very companies that dismissed our account. I have stroked the sides of new iron steamers and felt their engines thrum. I have watched the wireless masts go up, heard the uncanny crackle of distant voices carried through air itself. Yet none of these wonders has lessened the memory of that vast, patient presence under our small wooden hull. Twice, in later years, I sought to understand what had held us. Once, on a calm afternoon, I took a canoe alone beyond the reef, far enough that the island lay low and blue behind me. I lay on the outrigger and peered down, watching the weave of light on the bottom. The sea there was harmless, filled with darting fish, ordinary in every respect. Yet every time a long shadow passed, a shoal, a drifting cloud, I felt my breath shorten, waiting for it to draw alongside and keep pace. Another time I met Matau in Colonia after a long separation. We sat on a crate by the pier, watching a new German steamer come in, its screw churning the water. I asked him whether he had heard anything further of Lioumere from his own elders. He stared at the ship's wake for a long time before replying. "They say that when it chooses not to take a man," he said at last, "it allows him to return so that his fear may carry its name inland." Then he rose and left, as if the words themselves had pressed too closely upon him. In my own house, there are small reminders that I did not earn. When my grandchildren leave their gourds by the door overnight, the dew on them in the morning sometimes forms 3 parallel streaks instead of smooth beads. In the season of calms, when the air lies heavy and the lagoon is without ripple, I have woken before dawn to that same sense that all ordinary sound has been drawn out of the world and held elsewhere for a time. There are triggers that call back the weight of those days regardless of my will. The smell of old rope dried and then wetted anew can, in an instant, become that musk on the back of my tongue. The sudden silence that falls when birds leave a grove together will take me, without warning, to that moment when the terns rose and fled. Once, during a visit to Colonia, I saw a German compass in a shop window, its glass unblemished, its needle steady on north. My hands began to tremble so violently that I had to steady them on the wall. I have tried, on quiet evenings, to reason my way through what we experienced. A man of this age is expected to trust only in currents and soundings, in the mathematics of longitude. Perhaps it was a whale of some unknown kind, one that travels in company with ships for reasons of diet or curiosity. Perhaps each man's grief and longing conjured familiar voices from the ordinary sighing of the sea. Perhaps the fall of Haas was no more than misstep and fear's embroidery. Yet when I close my eyes and feel again that cold rising through the planks, that steady, unhurried breathing, I know that such explanations are devices meant to soothe the day's mind, not satisfy the night's. The old woman at Sapwauphik had not spoken of whales or delusion. She had said simply, "It follows. It chooses." We were followed. A choice was made. One detail remains with me more sharply than any other, more even than the loss of my captain or the sight of my brother's long-gone face upon the water. On that final dawn, when the musk had fled and the first true breeze had filled our sails, I went below to check the bilge one last time. The stains we had scrubbed away days before had returned, darker and more defined. 3 long parallel streaks, exactly spaced as before, ran along the inner hull where no hand or brush could easily reach. Between 2 of them, faint but incontrovertible, lay a 4th, shorter mark, as of a thumb set between fingers.